Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy. Hermit, have you ever learned something from observing nature, or from considering the sequential outflow of events in time?
I've learned much from observing nature, yes. Enough that I struggle to give just one example. As for events in time, I've learned from that too. For example, I've had ideas similar to impermanence since before I studied the Dharma. Why do you ask?
The Buddha teaches that reality itself can preach the Dharma to us. In other words, we can gain enlightenment through persistent and systematic observation of the world around us. Granted, it may be harder and take longer than if a Buddha helped guide us, but it's possible nonetheless.
Yes, I think we've touched on this idea a few times before. That would lead to the Pratyeka Buddha path, right?
Some say it does. They believe that in the absence of a Buddha with the 32 physical marks, people are pursuing the Pratyeka Buddha path. However, others believe that nature is itself the body of the Buddha. So the outflow of events, the emergence of nature itself, is nothing other than the actions and the sermons of the Buddha himself.
This seems to imply a personified Buddha behind the outflow of events. If indeed the world preaches to us from all sides, then the Buddha might be there communicating to us from beyond our conscious perception, behind the curtain, if you will.
You would think so, but the truth is that there is and there isn't. On the one hand, the Buddha himself, whom we know and learn from, is part of that reality preaching to us. On the other hand, all that is ever being preached is the truth of the way things are. In that way, they are expressions of a nature of universal enlightenment.
Which implies something like universal Buddhahood, or a universe that is all the Buddha.
Indeed.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be discussing the Buddha Vairocana. Who is Vairocana? What is his history? How ought we understand him? We hope you enjoy. So, who is Vairocana?
Vairocana is a major Buddha in Mahayana and Vajrayana Buddhism. He is the primary Buddha of Shingon and Tibetan Buddhism. He is called Dari Rulai in Chinese, Dainichi Nyorai in Japanese, and Dail Yodai in Korean. He also has names that are more direct transliterations of his Sanskrit name. In Chinese, his more direct transliterated name is Pilu Jena Fo. In Japanese, it is Biru Shana Butsu, and in Korean, it is Biro Jana Bu. The difference in the naming and translation conventions will become clearer in the second question concerning his history. All of his names have a connotation with the sun or with light. Vairocana's Sanskrit name translates roughly to from the sun or belonging to the sun, and the difference between the two naming conventions in the rest of East Asia is that in one case the name was transliterated or rendered for sound, and then the other names were rendered for meaning. We'll discuss why those two conventions emerged side by side in a moment. Vairocana is commonly thought to be the Dharmakaya, or the Dharma body, of the historical Buddha Shakyamuni. This is how he is introduced in the first sutra in which he appears, the Brahmajala Sutra, or the Brahma's Net Sutra. I recommend re-listening to our episode number 59, What is the Three Bodies Doctrine in Buddhism? Link in the show notes. As we discussed in that episode, from a doctrinal perspective, the Dharmakaya is a very abstract thing. On the one hand, the Dharmakaya is a metaphorical rendering of the entire body of sutras and sermons that the Buddha has ever given. And on the other hand, the Dharmakaya is an anthropomorphized deity that is very human in appearance, so as to be more intelligible and relatable. In that sense, worshipping Vairocana is thought to be totally equivalent to worshipping the entire Dharma itself. The sutra in which Vairocana is introduced was commonly thought to have originated in Sanskrit, only to be translated by Kumarajiva into Chinese in 406 CE. But now most scholars tend to agree that it was most likely composed in East Asia by unknown authors in the mid-5th century, and is thus apocryphal. We have talked about sutras composed in China as quote-unquote apocryphal throughout the show, and I would like to take a brief aside and clarify that the term apocryphal is of very limited use at best and is useless at worst. The definition of the term is, quote, of doubtful authenticity, unquote. It is often used in Buddhist studies to mean non-canonical, and in this case it means that the sutra is not in the Pali canon or does not have a Sanskrit or Pali equivalent. The reason I say that apocryphal is a useless word is because if the sutra in question was authored 1500 or 1600 years ago and everyone reads it and uses it, is it not authentic? What actually is the standard for authenticity? The Buddha and his first and his second generation of disciples never wrote anything down. What's more, the sutras were not written down by any one single person, so authenticity can't be measured by who wrote it. The sermons were also written down over a period of 1,000 years, so a time frame also cannot be a standard. Apocryphal is a term originating in Christian historiography, and it's not even useful for that, but it is even less so for Buddhism, so we should know that when we say it. Back to Vairocana. We also met him in the Avatamsaka Sutra, and that is where we first see him being described as having attained enlightenment countless ages ago and being indistinct from the entirety of the universe. When we revisit the Avatamsaka Sutra, I want to pick another Vairocana section of that text and discuss the problem that comes up when Vairocana is described that way. The problem is one of contradictory cosmologies. In other sutras, we learn that we live in Shakyamuni's Pure Land, Jambudvipa. We also learn that Amida has a Pure Land, Akshobhya has a Pure Land, Ratnasambhava has a Pure Land, and Vairocana has a Pure Land. Every Buddha has a Pure Land. We get various explanations as to where they are, who lives in them, and how to get to them, but it seems like a common assumption in the various texts that these Pure Lands do not overlap. We are also led to believe that there are realms in the universe that are not Pure Lands because a Buddha has not arisen in that realm. In the Avatamsaka Sutra, a lot of this gets turned on its head. We learn that Shakyamuni is a manifestation of Vairocana, and all of the universe is a Pure Land that has been purified by Vairocana himself. Within that grand universal Pure Land is all of the other Pure Lands of other Buddhas. These are like microcosms of the greater one, but to us they are the size of immeasurable macrocosms. This is why concepts in the Avatamsaka Sutra like interpenetration of phenomena and emptiness and cosmology can be very hard to wrap one's head around.
What is Vairocana's history?
When we have asked this question in previous episodes, where we do deep dives into a figure, it's common that we trace a history of a Buddha in the sutras, or we examine the story of a historical figure. For this one, I would like to do a blend of the two and discuss how worship of Vairocana has evolved over time. In discussing this, it will become clear how and why there came to be two naming conventions for him that are more or less equally common, when he got the title of Mahavairocana instead of just Vairocana, and how he became so central to Chinese and Japanese Buddhism before the rise in popularity of Amidism, or Pure Land Buddhism focusing on Amida. In China, the use of dharanis and mantras occurred as early as the 2nd century CE. Sometimes these mantras or dharanis would be centered on Vairocana, but other times they would reference Shakyamuni, or they would reference a particular part of the Dharma. We have discussed how mantras can commonly be associated with a particular Buddha in episodes 24, What are Mantras?, 48, What are Dharani?, and 52, What are Tantras? Dharanis can also be associated with one particular section of a sermon, but they are also considered condensed versions of sections of a sutra. In other words, they are like mnemonic codes or matrices that can be unpacked into a full text portion of a sutra, a bit like a compressed or a zipped folder in computing. The key component of dharanis and mantras is that they are regarded as sacred and magical sounds in their original language of Sanskrit, so translating them for meaning is a misuse. The original syllables had to be preserved, and so were transliterated for sound into Chinese and later into other languages, rather than being translated for meaning. However, the deity they referred to had a name that people called him, which was translated for meaning in the sutras so that it could be understandable and comprehensible to those who read it and studied it. So, for the purposes of dharani and mantra, Vairocana's name in Chinese was Pilu Zhena Fo, but it was Dari Rulai for the purposes of sutra reading and nomenclature. In the 7th century, the famous Empress Wu Zetian of China used Vairocana's image as a form of statecraft. This was a very historically significant occurrence for Buddhism and for Chinese history. In the 7th century, Chinese society was heavily influenced by Confucian governance, ideals, and thought, and Confucianism can be very inflexible on issues of gender. There is very little room for women to rise to positions of power and prominence in a Confucian society. They have very strictly mandated roles in the Confucian classics as daughters, mothers, and wives, and to leave that role for the role of ruler or bureaucrat was to violate the entire social, political, and cosmological order. Buddhism, if you can believe it, is actually better on issues of gender equality than Confucianism. So, Wu Zetian sought Buddhism as a religious, political, and social vehicle toward increased authority and legitimacy over society at the time. I don't want to make her sound like a manipulator. She may have been a faithful and genuine Buddhist, but regardless, it was strategic on her part to elevate Buddhism to the level that she did in society, and to align herself with it. So, she commissioned the construction of statues of Vairocana and other Buddhas at the Longmen Grottos, a famous complex of caves and grottos in modern-day Hunan province. She commissioned the statues of Vairocana Buddha to be fashioned using her face as a model, visually portraying herself as indistinct from Vairocana. She also had written sutra commentaries and done divination and meditation rituals to declare herself as the incarnation of Vairocana, as well as, somehow, the incarnation of Maitreya Buddha. Here, the worship of the state became indistinct from worship of the Buddha. Gender became a non-issue for her rule, and Buddhism was patronized, elevated, and popularized until it became competitive with Confucianism, at least at the level of the wealthy elite. At this point in history, Vairocana got the title Mahavairocana, which means Great Vairocana. By the 9th century, the Tang dynasty, esoteric Buddhism had become the most common type of Buddhism and the most popular religion in China. Esoteric Buddhism, specifically Zhenyun Buddhism, Hua-Yen Buddhism, and Tiantai Buddhism, flourished in China, with patrons such as Amoghavajra, the master of Huiguo, who was himself the master of Kukai. In 804, Kukai visited and studied under Huiguo, receiving the Dharma from him, and brought Shingon Buddhism back to Japan in 806. Simultaneously, the founder of Japanese Tendai Buddhism traveled to China in 803, studied with Dao Sui, and returned in 805, and founded Tendai Buddhism. I mention them both because Tendai and Shingon are both esoteric forms of Buddhism that prescribe worship of Vairocana, but Tendai emphasizes the Lotus Sutra more heavily than the worship of Vairocana. Kukai and Saicho knew each other, and were at times friends, rivals, and colleagues in the Japanese Buddhist world. When these forms of Buddhism arrived back in Japan, the emperor commissioned the both of them to create bases of operations, Shingon at Takao-sanji, and later Todaiji, and Saicho, the founder of Tendai, at Mount Hiei. And the emperor instructed them to get to work training up monks, copying and translating sutras, and doing ritual services for the aristocracy. As time went on, Shingon and Tendai, sponsored and patronized by the imperial family, became the de facto state religion of Japan, as all state-facilitated rituals became Shingon and Tendai-style ordinations, sutra readings, and rituals for state preservation. Similarly to the case of Wu Zetian, Vairocana's association with the sun was similarly co-opted to reinforce the authority and the holiness of the Japanese emperor and imperial family. The Japanese emperor is regarded as the living descendant of Amaterasu, kami of the sun, and so the emperor could simultaneously be a living kami, a manifestation of a Buddha, and an emperor all at one time with this association with Vairocana. This persisted until the 1500s or 1600s, so nearly 1,000 years of Japanese history. It was not until far into the Warring States period of Japanese history, from the 1400s to 1600, that the popularity and the authority of esoteric Buddhism becomes superseded by Pure Land Buddhism and other Kamakura schools of Buddhism like Zen and Nichiren Buddhism.
How ought we understand Vairocana?
I will preface this first part of my answer by saying that this is a personal interpretation that is likely not backed up by any sort of scholarly consensus. I think that one of my biggest takeaways from the sections of the Avatamsaka Sutra that I have read and from other Vairocana-related stuff that I've read is that he is recursive. He is the universe, and when we see him in statue or icon form, that is the universe appearing to us from within itself. I think there is a similar interpretation of God and Jesus in Christianity. God is abstract and omnipresent and unintelligible, but Jesus is God in mortal human form with a face and the ability to talk to people and preach to them. This recursivity of Vairocana goes further in the sense that he can and does also manifest himself as other Buddhas, such as Amida, Shakyamuni, and the others of the Jusan Butsu, or the 13 Buddhas, who all represent different aspects of him. To switch to an aspect of interpreting Vairocana that is more backed up by scholarly consensus, we can also speak about his being indistinct from the Dharma itself, and how that came about in Buddhist history. When the Shakyamuni Buddha was alive and preaching, the Dharma was described by him as being objective truth and the way to realizing that very objective truth. He didn't make it up, he just discovered it, and others could discover it too with his guidance. His guidance took the form of sermons. Then he died, and he was remembered for having discovered and shared this truth and the way to it with us. But all we had by way of guidance for discovering it ourselves were the sutras that he left behind. Those sermons were regarded as the truth and the way to it, as well as the remains of the Buddha himself. In that way, the Buddha was seen as indistinct from the truth and the way to it. This was supported further by sutras which described the Buddha as a living manifestation of the Dharma. Thinking of the Buddha as indistinct from the Dharma solved anxieties about whether it was possible to actually attain enlightenment in a world without a Buddha. In this way, we have the sutras, and they are the Buddha and the Dharma all in one. The next question that arises is, if Vairocana is the whole universe, then should we understand him as an omnipotent figure that can control the unfolding of reality? In other words, when things happen, should we interpret that as being under Vairocana's direct sentient control? This question is complicated, and we discuss it some in our reading and discussion of the Vajrasekhara Sutra, but I want to repeat some of that discussion here. On the one hand, a huge part of the Dharma is the teaching of karma, and we have talked about how Buddhism can sort of be victim-blamey in the sense that it regards bad things that happen to people as being a result of their bad karma from past lives, something they have no control over in this life. On the other hand, we have also discussed how karma is not itself sentient. There is no arbiter sitting back weighing the scales of a person's morality and deciding what they are owed. In other words, bad karma is not a debt that is paid in calamity and suffering. It is a passive, reflexive property of the universe. Bad begets bad, and good begets good. Our behaviors create momentum, and that momentum directly leads into that which happens to us and that which we experience. The same can be applied to the scale of Vairocana himself. The Dharmakaya, the world we live in, is not being driven by a sentient decision-making mind. Instead, it is just an objective and the way to get to it. However, that does not negate the fact that Vairocana is an object of worship with a face and the ability to preach to people and enlighten them. To use a horrible analogy with many problems, Vairocana is to the Dharma as Siri is to the Apple iPhone operating system. The iPhone operating system user can make phone calls, send texts, set alarms, set reminders, Google stuff, and more simply by manipulating and navigating the phone. However, Siri is like a face or a personification of the phone's ability to do those things. Siri herself cannot make calls or manipulate the operating system of her own volition. She needs a user. She can't set your wallpaper, she can't add new contacts, or take pictures for the user. The user needs to manipulate either the operating system or operate her to accomplish those goals. Siri is an intelligible and a relatable face that some feel makes it easier to accomplish their goal of using the operating system. Similarly, Siri is a component of that very Apple operating system. Just like Vairocana, the icon is the Dharma/the universe appearing to us from within itself. Where this analogy falls apart is that Vairocana is not a piece of data mining AI-assisted software that harps on the misogynistic, subservient female secretary archetype. He is much more readily personified and anthropomorphized into a Buddha with the goal of enlightening sentient beings.
We hope you enjoyed this week's discussion of Vairocana. Join us next week where we will be discussing the early Buddhist Nikaya schools. What were the Nikaya schools? What did they believe? What happened to them? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. If you like our show and you want to financially support it, we ask that you instead send that generosity to support a worthy cause. For now, we ask that you support victims of the floods that struck Central Texas in early July. As of this recording, there are nearly 120 people confirmed dead, with over 170 people still missing. We've included a link to GoFundMe pages in our show notes. If you can, please join us in helping these people recover from this tragedy. Thank you. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have any questions that you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, review, or subscribing. You can also reach us by email at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.